computational model that I want to build from this data. It's wonderful to be able to classify tasks, but that's again still just a descriptive analysis of what the eye movements and how they are connected to this high-level task, this instruction. To go beyond that, what I like to use modeling, the way I like to think about modeling, is that it becomes less about just being able to connect the data to the task. Lots of very clever computer algorithms can do that very efficiently, very accurately. But it doesn't always tell us much about the way that the visual system works, that the way cognition works. Because these models sometimes do it in ways that our brains don't. So just pure accuracy isn't always the best measure. We also want to constrain these algorithms to see how accurate they are when they have the same constraints that we have cognitively, that we have in our visual system. So that's what I want to do with this model, to see if this classifier can be improved to tell us something about the way that we generate eye movements given our internal attentional state. So that's the goal of this model, not just accuracy anymore, but informative about the way that we generate eye movements, the way the eye movement system works. So, right, it's not just data analysis, it's not just prediction accuracy, it's mimicking the way that the visual system works. And it should at least demonstrate a plausible human solution, something that is possible, the way that we do it. I'm not saying that it has to be at a neural level. All good models don't have to be neural networks. They don't have to implement single neurons in order to tell us about the way that the brain works. One of my favorite quotes is Norbert, the best model of a cat is another cat, or even better, the same cat. And this tells us that a perfect model is the brain itself, every single neuron being modeled. But that doesn't tell us about how it works. So we have to extract from that. We have to be a little more general than this low-level model to understand how things work. So I will go through a number of steps, and hopefully I'll go through these in enough detail that we will be able to work on this model together. The first thing is the question that we heard earlier on, is the idea that the task instructions that we give our participants are not necessarily the internal state, the attentional state that they are in when they're doing the task. So we like to think that there's a high degree of overlap, that they try to do the task that we give. But there's probably attentional states that we're not directly instructing. And they may switch between these internal states. So that's my first thought on this. And in order to get at that, I want to do a couple of steps. If these four tasks generate different internal states, I want to try to find out how many internal states there are. So that's my first task. Second, I want to take these new internal states that I discover and assign eye movements and saccades to the most likely states that generated them. So my idea is that we give a task that triggers an internal state in the participant, and this internal state generates the eye movements for that particular task. So I want to build a model based on that structure. And I want to build a model where these internal states are that hidden layer that we see in between the task that we assign and the eye movements that are generated. And of course, this means that we have to add a temporal component. Those models that we saw earlier on, or the classifiers that we saw earlier on, ignored time. All eye movements were condensed into one time. But this new model, since it's going to account for changes in internal state, so we may change from one internal state to another, all within the same task. In order to do that, this new model has to be sensitive to time. So it has to be able to change over time. And I want to be able to test the model against the data that we have to see if it still is able to generate eye movements. So,
Вступительная часть была посвящена тому, для чего же, собственно, нужно моделирование. Уже был предвосхищающий вопрос Александра, который спросил, уверены ли мы в том, что испытуемые действительно следуют инструкции, все они это делают одинаково. Задача моделирования, в отличие от предыдущей задачи построения классификатора, отличается тем, что здесь нас интересует не столько точность классификации, сколько соответствие этой модели, которую мы построили, тому, как реально работает мозг. Поэтому нужно выбрать, во-первых, соответствующий уровень. Модель не должна быть слишком подробной, она совсем не обязательно должна быть на нейронном уровне, не нужно моделировать каждый отдельный нейрон. Далее, в модели, которую строит Джозеф, предполагается наличие некоторого количества внутренних состояний, и одна и та же задача может вызывать различные внутренние состояния испытуемого, и в то же время мы можем провести соответствие между внутренним состоянием и параметрами движений глаз. И что очень важно, в этой модели также должна присутствовать динамика, поскольку если раньше мы рассматривали движение глаз вне зависимости от времени, вне зависимости от того, как эти внутренние состояния могут друг друга сменять, то теперь возникает некоторая динамика смены этих внутренних состояний.
So one place I'd like to start for any model of a visual system is this theoretical model from Schiller in 1999. It's a wonderful, slightly dated now, but a wonderful description of the full cycle of the eye movement system, of the saccadic system. From beginning with the eye, going through LGN, into the early visual areas, into the posterior and the anterior pathways, into the frontal eye fields, information back to the superior colliculus again, to the brainstem, and back to the eye again. So that the full cycle of input into the eye and then back out to generate another eye movement. So it's a wonderful descriptive pathway of how that information flows through the visual system. So for this particular model, I'd like to focus on this part here. So with the task and internal attentional state, I'll be thinking of the frontal eye fields, maybe the prefrontal cortex for generating attentional state, and then which sends information to the superior colliculus and brainstem to generate those eye movements. So this is the area that I'm focusing on for this particular model. The other thing that I want to, another constraint I want to add to my model is that I want no homunculus. Is everyone familiar with that term? Yes. The homunculus? Right.
Actually, the symbol of the seminar is homunculus.
Oh, really? Okay. Am I going to be kicked out now because I don't want the homunculus? Okay. It's a good placeholder, but for cognition, we don't want to just assume that something else is generating these attentional states. Something, some little man with switches is telling us which state we're in and which one we're not. I'd like this model to generate and choose its own internal states based on the information that it has. So this is a goal of the model that I don't want this high-level homunculus choosing internal states for us. So given that internal state is different from task, or could be different from task, I wanted to take a look at how we can detect these tasks. And we do have behavior. The whole idea of these models is that they're generative models. And that means that the state of the system generates the eye movement properties. That is the way that Bayesian modeling works. It's a generative model system. And because of that, we can also work our way backwards and look for hidden states. Bayesian algorithms, like hidden Markov models, allow for states that we can't see. And we can try to infer what those states are based on the observations. So we have lots of eye movement observations, and we want to try to infer what the internal state is in between the eye movements and the instructed task. So the first thing to do is we need to figure out how many of those internal states likely generated the eye movements that we see. And for that, I used a couple of algorithms, a couple of automatic learning, so clustering algorithms. And there's a nice index called Dunn's index that if you compare a number of different clustering solutions, it tells you which one is most, has the best clusters. So what it does, it compares the compactness and separateness of the clusters. So if these group of eye movements look really similar and this group of eye movements look very similar, Dunn's index tells us how compact each group is compared to how separate they are. And the lower the Dunn's index is, the more compact and separate they are. So I compared Dunn's index for a number of different clusters, from 2 clusters all the way up to 14 clusters. So I ran this clustering algorithm on the eye movement data, and with that different number of clusters in it. And it turns out that 6 or 7 has the lowest Dunn's index. So our compactness and separateness is best when we have either 6 or 7 clusters, 6 or 7 groups of eye movement properties. And we went with the assumption that the fewer clusters that do the same job is better. So with this, I ended up with 6 clusters of eye movements, and by the same measure, 6 internal states that generated those clusters of eye movements. So first we have the number of 6 as the number of internal states that we use. Then there might be some questions on that as well.
У Джозефа есть даже некоторые предположения о том, каким может быть нейроанатомический субстрат этих внутренних состояний. Он показывал на слайде, с одной стороны, есть набор структур головного мозга, которые, собственно, генерируют, производят движение глаз, регулируют их, а с другой стороны, есть набор структур, которые могут порождать эти внутренние состояния, состояние внимания, в частности, префронтальная кора и лобные глазовидительные поля. И вот с такими базовыми представлениями он приступил к построению модели. Важный вопрос при построении модели, какое количество вот этих самых внутренних состояний взять, предположить. Для того, чтобы ответить на этот вопрос, он использовал алгоритм без учителя, то есть сначала он классифицировал движение глаз на основании их характеристик и посмотрел, сколько, в принципе, групп кластеров может получиться. А потом оценил различные решения с помощью индекса, который оценивал качество кластеризации. И получилось, что нужно брать те модели, в которых примерно 6 или 7 внутренних состояний для вот этих 4 задач.
So everyone's happy that we have 6 internal states?
For 4 tasks, yes, probably.
Okay. So, and that's exactly what...
There is a question. set a task, like go search, or like choose, say about your preferences or whatever, do it trigger one or two or three or four or all 6 things, or just one or just a limited number of them?
I'm glad you asked that question. Because the next thing we have to do is relate these to the tasks. That's part of the information that we have.
You mentioned about the previous slide. I think that the clusterization was applied to mean data. Why mean and what you average over each data?
Right. It's the mean data for a given trial. So the trials each were 6 seconds long, and we still had many subjects and many images that went into that. So we still had hundreds of data points going into those clusters.
So you classify here trials.
For this particular clustering, yes, we used size. We did test later on back to the individual eye movements again, but the clustering for it's always a trade-off. When you use individual eye movements, you have more data points, but they're much noisier. There's a lot more variance. With mean data, there's fewer data points, but there's less variance. So in the earlier version, we switched back and forth to see both of those. But this one, I thought, let's go with a stronger representation with the mean data to start. And just a couple of visualizations to show the cohesiveness of these clusters. You can do what's called a salmon projection. And this takes high-dimensional clustering data. So each eye movement has a lot of information in it. The velocity, the amplitude, the duration. Each one of those is a dimension. But we can bring that down into 2 dimensions using salmon projections so we can draw the clusters. So here is a salmon projection of 2 different types of projections of the same clustering data to show that we really can see how separate that these clusters are. So this is just it's hard to do nice pictures of machine learning data. So when we get a chance to do it, it's always good to throw it in. So the question on internal states and tasks, how these things relate to each other. Do participants tend to stay in one state for an entire task? Do they tend to switch back and forth? What I did was a correlation matrix, a cross-tabulation between the 4 different tasks and the 6 different internal states. And what we see here is that there is definitely a strong correlation between these 2. The chi-squared is at 0.001. So it's a very strong correlation between the 2, but no single internal state describes a single task, instructive task. So this tells us that participants are probably switching between a number of different internal states on a given task. For example, the search task, 25% overlap between the first internal state. Less so on this one. State 2 doesn't figure as highly as some of the others. But state 3 is very high again. And state 6 is also quite high for search. So search seems to be a mix of state 1, maybe a bit of state 3, and also state 6. Whereas viewing tends to be very strongly in state 2 and state 5. So we do see strong correlation between these, but it's not a one-to-one correlation. Each of these tasks tend to produce multiple internal states as optimized by the clustering. notice our preference here is, again, it's very difficult to choose any combination of these internal states that distinctly show preference as different from the other ones. So maybe the reason why we were unable to classify preference is because it's an equal measure of all of these different internal states. They're switching between memorizing and viewing and searching. I like ice cream, so I'm going to search for ice cream. And if I find ice cream, then I'm going to say that I really, really like this picture. So they're switching between these different types of states for preference task. But there is a strong correlation. So we have our 6 states. We know that the states are strongly related to eye movements because that's how we chose these states. We also know that they are correlated with the tasks. So we want to build a model where a task influences the internal state. The internal state can change within a single trial, and the internal state generates a different pattern or distribution of eye movements. And we want to do that in a way with no homunculus. There's nobody switching between the tasks. And there was a wonderful paper by Miller and Cohen in 2001 that showed how you can do that using what they called bias signals. So in their description, these bias signals in the prefrontal cortex can basically switch the internal state of cognition into a different state based on the previous state and certain amounts of input. So signals would change the state in the same way that, let's say, a self-switching train track would switch the direction of the entire train. So if cognition is the train and it's going in a certain direction, a self-switching track would have a trickle effect throughout the rest of the prefrontal cortex. So that's the type of idea that I wanted to use in the model. So there's nothing in the model that changes the internal state from afar. The internal state changes itself. And there's a wonderful model in artificial intelligence and machine learning that does just something like this. It's called the Partial Observable Markov Decision Process, POMDP, just because it's too much of a mouthful to say anything else. And it, again, we have our observations, it has actions, and it has internal states. So the internal states generate the results. So in our case, attentional states generate eye movements, and they can be influenced by outside forces, like our task instructions. So this is the model that I chose to implement this computational model. And I did it in a wonderful program called Genie. It's a visual Bayesian modeling program that allows you to drag and drop pieces and import data sets and train them up. Even if you're not familiar with machine learning and artificial intelligence, Genie is a wonderful program to play with. It's very intuitive. So our model basically adds an extra step from our classifier. So we have our external task, and this doesn't change over time. Anything in this box changes from one time step to the next time step, to the next time step. But task is outside that because we only give the instructions once at the start of the trial. So that is the input into this. We give our participant the instructions, and that influences the selection of the internal state. The internal state then generates eye movement properties from a random distribution given that internal state. each internal state has its own distribution of eye-movement properties that it randomly generates from. The internal state, you can also see the circular arrow here, meaning that the internal state at any particular time influences the internal state at the next time. So the only thing that helps us influence, that helps us choose, helps this model choose what internal state the participant is in, is the task that was given at the start, the current internal state, and whatever internal state that tends to move towards. So, and the model will learn all of these connections, given the data set that we have from those 63 participants.
Раскрылась все-таки таинственная связь между внутренними состояниями и задачей. Было показано, что нет четкого соответствия между какой-либо одной задачей и одним внутренним состоянием. Скорее, есть профиль внутренних состояний, характерный для каждой задачи. И опять же, когда мы смотрели эти профили, прояснилась ситуация с задачей оценки привлекательности изображения. Дело в том, что у этой задачи по сравнению с другими нет своего характерного профиля, и поэтому она легко смешивается с остальными. Теперь, что касается компьютерной модели, которую на основе этих данных построил Джо, к ней были определенные требования. В частности, одно из этих требований заключалось в том, чтобы в модели не было гомункулуса, то есть чтобы никто не переключал внутренние состояния, они переключались сами собой, и, соответственно, единственное, что предопределяет следующее внутреннее состояние в этой модели, это данная инструкция задачи и совокупность предыдущих внутренних состояний. Джо сравнил это с поездом, в котором головной вагон определяет движение последующих, и вот этот вот поезд внутренних состояний определяет свою траекторию. После чего мы узнали о том, как конкретно устроена эта модель, о том, что ее можно создать в программе Джинни, которую Джозеф всем рекомендует для освоения, если кто-то хочет начать знакомиться с этой областью на практике.
Everyone's happy with this so far?
Is it available for free?
Yes, Genie is free. It's open source and it's free to download. Okay, wonderful. This is very new work. I just presented this at a conference in St. Petersburg, but some of the earlier work in Europe. I'm just ready to submit this, hopefully, to a journal. So if everyone here is happy with this, please leave me your name, and I'm going to be suggesting you as reviewers. I think I might get some complaints about it, but I'm glad everyone's happy so far. So, given that the model starts with our instruction, search, view, preference, or memorize, from that we have our internal state that either searching or viewing or something. These are hidden states, so we don't have names or labels for them just yet. And from that, the visual system chooses an eye movement from a particular distribution. Now we have two things that we can try to classify. Given an eye movement pattern, because inference always goes against the arrows here, causality goes up, inference goes down. Given our eye movement patterns, can we accurately predict the internal state of the model? And then, given the internal state, can we accurately predict the task? That's the new goal of this overall model. So eye movements, predicting internal state from eye movements, we have a very, very accurate model. And this is where the improvement comes over the being able to predict the task directly. Because like we discovered, the task we give isn't always the state that our participants are in. So given that we separate those two, it's not a surprise that we're able to increase our accuracy a great deal. And then just given the internal state, are we able to predict the task that's given. So it's the one piece of information, the internal state of 1 to 6. And again, we do have above chance performance, 30%, but here it's an extremely biased classifier. It's choosing view and search even when it could be one of the other two. So memorized and preference, it's only predicting that over 3% of the time. So it only reaches this result by being extremely biased towards predicting view tasks and search tasks. So we are taking a drop in accuracy on being able to predict a task with this model. But like I said, the main purpose of this model is to understand the process of the visual system and the attentional states, as opposed to the other algorithm, the earlier algorithm, that's only goal was to be accurate. So it didn't care whether it was the way that the visual system worked or not. By adding these constraints that do model the way the visual system works, we lose some accuracy here, but we are extremely accurate on predicting that internal state. Again, I mentioned that the neural model, the Bayesian model, isn't neurally accurate. So my next steps for this one is to bring this into a more neural network model. And there are a number of algorithms that I want to try use on that one. There's a distribution of Gaussians and a mixture of experts that does a really nice job of mimicking this type of POMDP, but at a more neurally accurate level. So that's some of the next steps that I'm going to be working on. And conclusions. Task does seem to generate distinct patterns and distributions of eye movements for some, but not all tasks. Some tasks don't seem to generate unique patterns of eye movements. And we can model this even when we include the hidden attentional state that we usually assume is going on with our participants. The task doesn't completely overlap with the attentional step that they find themselves in. And we can model these attentional state biases and these attentional states changing over time, even without resorting to a homunculus that is sort of switching the states for us. The internal states are choosing themselves. And we still manage to get a nice model, an accurate model for those. So, thank you very much. That was a lot of math, so thank you for holding on with it.
May. Would it be accurate to say that the classifier approach is a kind of black box principle which maps external stimuli like your tasks onto overt behavior, whereas in your model you are trying to explain all the connections, how they might really work?
Absolutely. I should write that down. That's a wonderful way of putting it. But yes, a black box approach is often used when you don't care about the internal workings. You only want to connect the input to the output. And that's exactly what the classifier was shooting for.
And then my other question is, would you be able to construct your model if you haven't done your classifier work before that? Is it possible, or
you can jump straight to a model, yes, but often with these algorithms, I always like to go back to that Schiller paper that shows the breakdown of components. It's always easier to focus on one small thing at a time and then piece them together. The algorithms, I find anyway, tend to build a much more robust unit together when you break the parts down into smaller pieces. I may not have come up with that POMDP solution if I hadn't started with a naive-based classifier.
And my last minor point is this POMDP is your own model that you develop, or is it it's a class of models, or
This is, I haven't developed any new machine learning algorithms myself.
also this POMDP is a kind of type of models that you
Yes.
employed.
They often use them in machine learning for robotics, for making decisions. They observe information, they have internal states, and they're able to generate choices based on that. So that they're used a lot in other areas of machine learning. It's been a while since I've been in the machine learning literature, so I'm happy to use all of the good work that other people have done rather than come up with my own. There's some wonderful algorithms over there that haven't been applied to cognition, that are just waiting to see what we can do.
Thank you.
The class analysis shows that there are 6 clusters. Why would you claim that they have some states? Why do they exist?
We are making an assumption that there's a layer between what we're saying, what we're telling the participant, and the eye movement generation. We do know from what we've been able to figure out on the visual system that there are definite top-down influences on the way we move our eyes. The frontal eye fields can generate eye movements on themselves just through top-down influences. So we know that there are top-down influences on the way that we choose eye movements, that generate eye movements. So there's something there. What that looks like, I chose to implement as an attentional set or attentional state based on some of the literature in that area. So whether it looks exactly like that or not, I don't know. But there's definitely something in between what we tell participants to do and that final selection of movements. And it's probably more complicated than just a single attentional state.
Could you please return the slide with the results of your last one? This one. Actually, the question is about the interpretation of the states and task solution. Because if we try to analyze the tasks, for example, search or view, they are pretty different. But if we, for example, discuss tasks like memorize or estimate in the preference task, it's always view and do something else, like view and memorize, view and place in your memory, view and say whether you like it or not. Whereas in the search task, it's from the very beginning the scanning of the image. So isn't it quite predictable that the search task in this model is the most distinguishable one, whereas the other tasks are somewhat similar to either view or search, but not the goal the subject has to achieve.
To be honest, the fact that they overlap a lot with view is exactly right. It's not that surprising. The fact that they overlap a lot with search was the surprising that we were able to get that much in it. This could be that people are switching to sort of a search mode, regardless of what we're telling them. That they will switch between just gradually looking around and then thinking, oh, I wonder if there is this in the picture, and then start searching for it, or something like that they are switching to this type. But even within view and search, those aren't individual internal states. They have strong overlap with some of the internal states, but they're not a single state in and of themselves. Even view has at least 2 strong components of this number 2 hidden state and this number 5 hidden state. So even view is alternating between 2 different internal states. But interpreting what these internal states are is another, that's a bigger task, and something I'd like to work on.
I have two questions, one more technical and one more general. So technical question is, do I understand correctly that for clustering you collapse the data over participants, so you have many trials but from different participants, so mixed?
That's correct, yes.
And what is the distribution of, is it the proportion of different states in different participants equal or similar, close to equal, or very different?
That's a good question. I haven't done a split by participant or image yet. And that's something that this was something that could actually be added in as another variable to state. So right now, I only have one influence that is determining the internal state. But if you think of participant or image as another external influence on this model, we might be able to include them as external influences and maybe even improve the accuracy based on that. So that's one point.
And another question is, so we know that typically for the same data we can find different models and they will fit nicely, equally nicely this data. Can you propose some critical test for your model that show that is it really a good model for the data or not?
Right. Another good question. Two things I will say before I come up with an answer for that. The first one is that one of the goals of a model is the plausibility of a model, whether it tells us something about one way that the mechanisms of cognition could work. The second is that the accuracy that we give here, while it's a very good test for the black box models, it's not always a good test for something like a model of cognitive state. One type of test that I do really like is a lesion model. And this is where you take a model and you can, if it's robust enough, you can lesion one part of it that mimics the way that certain patients might have brain lesions. So if I have one part of the model that is based on, that is implementing some part of the prefrontal cortex, the attentional state, if I disable or injure that part of the model and then compare the results to patients who also have lesions in that part of the brain, then we can see if my model behaves the same way as those patients behave compared to normals. That's one of the strongest tests I can think of for a good computational model. I don't have that data to do the comparison, but I would like.
A follow-up on that. So do this mean that your internal states have a different neural substrates, let's say within the prefrontal cortex?
That would be my working hypothesis right now.
Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. I want to say a few evident words about why 80% is extremely low accuracy, because your talk resembles very much data recognition and linguistic models. And in the second section, you showed accuracy from 50% to 80%, and in the third section, you showed accuracy of about 80% on the recognition of 6 internal states, right? If we, for example, imagine a speech recognizer for a mobile phone, which allows you to dictate a number, and which recognizes one of 10 digits, if it has 80% accuracy, it would fail on each 5th digit. So you wouldn't be able to dial a single number with this accuracy. So this accuracy is completely unacceptable, for example, for linguistic models. It shows, in your study, it shows that it is very difficult to classify patterns of eye movement depending on pure data pure movement data. In fact, you presented the eye movement at the beginning as a very complicated function with top-down processing, which involves, as we understood from examples on Yarko's evaluation, clothes evaluation, people evaluation, situation evaluation, and so on. Can we rely on the models, computer models, which wouldn't allow us to dial a single phone number? Can we rely on them, hoping that they would generate for us some internal structure of a cognitive model?
One step at a time on that. The first part of the question is the applied nature of some of these classifiers that are used in other domains, like text recognition. I mentioned spam and so on. Some of the spam classifiers are at 99% accuracy. Absolutely. There are two reasons why I would claim that the accuracy here is both good and not comparable to those other domains. Those other domains have a very distinct distribution of patterns. So if you think signal detection theory, where you have two distributions that you're trying to distinguish, in character recognition or speech recognition, those distributions are very far apart. So it's much easier to be able to separate those things based on properties. The second thing is that the goal of this is not necessarily accuracy. The goal of this is to understand the way that the human cognitive system works. So this is a small-scale model of one part of an extremely noisy system. And it goes an extra step into helping us learn what could be going on in an internal state. So where the goals of the other one is perfect classification, like we were saying, a black box solution is perfectly acceptable. Something that we don't care how it does the job as long as it successfully classifies. Whereas this one, we do care about how it works. We want it to work the same way that the human saccadic generation system works. And what we see with that is that even when we give participants different tasks, they often produce the same pattern of results. They're not perfectly distinguishable. So there's a lot of overlap in the eye movements that you generate when I tell you to do search versus viewing. So if the human system is very noisy and has a lot of overlap between these different states in the types of eye movements it generates, then the model that we're trying to use to understand that system must also be equally noisy. That would be my argument for that. If your contention is that the internal states of the visual system perfectly and completely generate different types of eye movements to begin with, then yes, our model should also be able to do that. But I don't think the human visual system works that way. I think there's more noise than that.
I wouldn't agree that linguistic processing is so noisy, because the signal is noisy, but we understand each other almost perfectly. We understand 100% of words in a newspaper. We understand all the words that another person says. So it is nearly 100% accurate.
And in that domain, a classifier that is modeling the human auditory system for parsing words, I would agree with you, should have a very high accuracy. And it should be able to match the accuracy that a human will recognize in that particular domain. But in the saccadic generation system, I think there's much more overlap between the internal states that generate those eye movements and the types of eye movements that are generated.
I would also suggest that inside your data, we can see the same problem like inside linguistic data, because if we look close at a signal like 1 or 5 in speech recognition, we shall see a consonant, a vowel, a consonant, some patterns. So it will be some internal states which go one after another like in your scheme. But if you discover them somehow automatically, you have to prove that these are reasonable states which correspond to linguistic model, or which allow us to successfully recognize the signal. If you don't do one of these 2 tasks, there is no reason to generate these 6 states, because if we take another classifier, it would generate 38 states, and we shall never choose what is correct.
It's possible that a different type of classifier would come up with a different type of states, or possibly a little bit more accurate. This is the first draft of the model, but it's still, I don't think any number. I did test between 2 and 14 states, and when you're talking about a classifier, the fewer number of classes that give you the same results, the better. So it's an efficiency of the algorithm. You can try to push for higher and higher accuracy. Every time you add another cluster, you are getting more accurate. It's guaranteed. You're adding more information, but it's at the cost of making it more and more complex. We could have an algorithm that's 100% accurate by each cluster containing one eye movement, and that would, of course, match eye movements perfectly. But it wouldn't tell us anything about the system, because we don't have tens of thousands of internal states generating tens of thousands of eye movements. So in this case, I don't think 100% accuracy is feasible. In some linguistics tasks, it might be. But in eye movement generation tasks, I don't think so.
Linguists are very confused, are frustrated about automatic processing, even with 95% accuracy, because if you have 95% of accuracy, you'll get a mistake in each 20th word or 20th sentence.
But when the 2 things, are you talking about models that are used in industry for helping like speech recognition, dragon dictation, and things like that? Or are you talking about models that help us understand the way the cognitive system works, the way the linguistic system works, the auditory system?
Different applied computational models.
Okay. Even the auditory system is different than the saccadic system, because, like you said, humans are at nearly 100% accuracy in picking up words coming across. So a model that is trying to understand that auditory system should also have the same accuracy. But the eye movement system doesn't generate extremely unique patterns of eye movements for different tasks. There's overlap, there are patterns there, but the patterns have a lot of overlap. And because the patterns within the visual system have a lot of overlap, then the model that we try to use to understand those systems should also have some overlap.
I would only say, if you allow, that we don't have to rely on computational models with quite low accuracy to let them design for us science, design for us scientific concepts with internal states.
If we're trying to understand the internal states, I think we do.
So the discussion probably gets a little bit circular, but everyone understood that some people would probably like that the internal states would be more defined in terms of what those states are.
Yes, that's always a problem with those clustering. It's called unsupervised learning. And one of the things with unsupervised learning is coming up with labels. What do those clusters mean? So what are those? What are they?
I have a question. Why are you supposed to find a very general mechanism for each strategy, and you don't concern the difference in schemes in scenes? Because obviously we have seen in a few research, as soon as you define 7 bigger parts of the image, you find difference in that movement. As soon as you compare regular pattern with a regular pattern, you find difference in it. And here you are trying to generalize it fully. Yes, I would compare it with this linguistic metaphor. It is as if you are trying to classify digits being pronounced in different languages, and you are looking for the general mechanism. Yes, why don't you try to find some interaction between image and the strategy?
I do like the idea of including image and subject, and I definitely would like to extend that to see if we can improve this model. It's a wonderful idea. The one thing I will say is that the version that I did have only looked at eye movement information like the low-level duration, the amplitude, and so on. And the earlier paper, the 2013 classifier paper, showed that that type of low-level information does seem to pass across different image types. Things that types of information that don't work across image type are spatial information. So different areas, different hotspots on the image. So if you use that as your training data, it definitely doesn't work across image. But this type of low-level information seems to work. But adding it could help it.
And also you mean types of images, yes, not just through all images.
But
okay. There could be such images where this structure is working this way, and other kind of images, but then when they work, it would work in other ways.
It could work. We could get, we had something like 60 images. We could get participants to say, group them according to similarity, and then use that as an input as well. Sure, yeah.
Thank you. We usually discuss fixation and statistic, but we know that the psychiatric subsystem is not unique in terms of our anatomy. So my question is, from your point of view, how could be significant, for example, pursued smooth movement in scanning our environment, and how it would be interesting to research such?
Right. Schiller did do a nice model of how this interacts with pursuit eye movements as well. Different analysis of different parts of the visual system that work with those two different types of eye movements. This was entirely on eye movements. I suspect that if I were to include something like pursuit eye movements in this, it would be an entirely different internal state. That this is a type of movement that's generated by, at least controlled by, a different type of system. So we would have an internal state with 6 different clusters for eye movements, and maybe a second internal state with 2, 3, 4 internal clusters that would generate certain properties of the pursuit system. I don't have any data on that, but that would be the first one on how it would fit into something like this. So this is definitely restricted to only the somatic system at the moment, but could be expanded at some point.
Еще вопросы или комментарии? Если таких больше нет, давайте поблагодарим еще раз докладчика. И следующая наша встреча будет через 2 недели здесь, в этом же месте. Будет не менее, надеюсь, интересный доклад, но на совершенно другую тему, и на русском языке. Нам придет Иван Николаевич Григорьев, который